Good morning, everyone, and a jet-lagged hard welcome to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this symposium, in particular Dr. Boni, Leanne, Calvin, for your most wonderful hospitality. It's a great pleasure and honor indeed to be here, to be part of this event. And I'm also very grateful to Dr. Tan for this very nice introduction, who very nicely made the link between elite sport and the need for integrity and governance. And this is where my talk is going to concentrate today. And I can assure you the husky voice is not because of the cold beer last night, but for other reasons. Can you hear me okay at the back? Thank you. I need to figure out how to operate this, but yeah, it's fairly straightforward. I understand that probably all of you work at the performance end of sport, and in your daily job you're all concerned with helping athletes grow, sustain, and excel, and of course bring all these important medals from different international competitions. As the presenters already mentioned, I work at the other end of sport, which is concerned with how to actually make this really happen, how to organize, how to help coaches, administrators, athletes travel, train, and have all the best possible conditions so they can excel. And what I actually do fits very nicely just in the middle of the topic of the symposium, because there is a big gap between youth and elite sport. And elite sport, as we know it today, is been hit by a number of problems and scandals. So I would like to begin with a rather messy slide, rather messy picture, which is representative of the kind of sport which we experience. And when we invite our youth to make the jump between young innocent people to become elite athletes, we need to be very clear as to what kind of sport we invite them to join, what kind of elite sport we would like to present, what is the real identity of this sport. So sport has been hit by a number of scandals, and there are plenty of publications on the subject, as you can see: match fixing, scandals in collegiate sport, doping, another match fixing. Recently, the European Sport Manager Quarterly published a special issue on the corruption of sport. There are several very interesting contributions in this volume. And a very quick search on Google Scholar, just in less than a second, if you type in corruption in sport, you get more than 86,000 hits. And this tells you a lot about the kind of sport we're dealing with. Supranational bodies such as the Council of Europe have taken note of this, and they put in place a number of measures and documents tackling the corruption in sport and all sorts of malpractices. And Wikipedia even took the trouble of putting together a collection, 24 different categories of sports scandals altogether. As you can see, we are very well documented. You can look it up yourself. This, of course, is not good because it represents governance failures. Failures on the part of sport organizations, on the part of athletes, coaches, volunteers, to uphold the integrity of sport. And this is really central. Interestingly enough, we all believe that the cure, the magic bullet to this, is governance. If we were to put good governance in place, inevitably sport will become cleaner, and this will enhance the integrity of sport. I have my concerns about this, and this is what I'm going to address today. A recent study by Dowling and colleagues on the governance in sport identified, legacies of major sporting events and the Olympics in particular, identified governance as the key topic. 54 publications out of 305 during the period of 2000 until 2016. And for those of you who remember, IOC recently conducted a major consultation exercise in the run of producing Agenda 2020, the strategic document for the Olympic movement. And the topic of governance came forward in terms of importance that needs to be considered and addressed within the sport and Olympic movement in particular. So we all tend to believe that governance is the key. So why do governance failures matter? This is the key question. They do matter because they concern the integrity of sport, and sport as a social institution in particular. Sport is a social institution which is based on values, the values of respect, the values of justice, which implies fairness, excellence, and competition. And the integrity of sport as a social institution is based on three key pillars. The first one is the social contract. We cannot have the practice of sport if we don't have a community of people, sport people, who care about this, who share those practices, and who compete on the basis that they agree upon certain rules and regulations. We all enter the competition in sport voluntarily, and we agree that we're going to abide by the spirit of the game. We value sport because of its intrinsic values, intrinsic good which it brings to the table. So the social contract is absolutely central. The second pillar on which the integrity of sport is based is a rule-governed competition. Those rules, of course, are mutually agreed by all participants. They are enforced by a range of different institutions, national, international institutions, and they dictate athletes' and officials' behavior in the field. And the final pillar, of course, is the actual processes, which are integral to the practice of sport. And as you can imagine, if we were to take out one of the pillars, the whole edifice of sport will crumble down. It won't stand. So the governance and integrity of sports concerns all these three pillars. So we'll talk about this in a minute. To illustrate this metaphor, we only need to look at the Olympic oath, which all athletes take, not only athletes, but officials and participants take. And the oath starts by naming the key stakeholders. And these are the athletes, the competitors, the officials, the coaches. So they all pledge that they're going to abide by the rules, they're going to respect the spirit of the game. And this is exactly what Pierre de Coubertin, the founder of the modern Olympics, expected from all participants in sport. The only thing he wanted from them was loyalty, sporting loyalty, which implies integrity. Abiding by the rules, respecting the spirit of the game. So these are the critical parts of the code. So it's absolutely central. But integrity is not just a virtue of the sport person, it's a virtue of all of us. And I'm sure that probably most of you will have seen this summer blockbuster movie, Crazy Rich Asians, hands up. So I don't have to tell you the plot of the movie. But for those who haven't seen the movie, which I personally saw, I'm very pleased. But my wife went a step further. She read the book, which I partly only read after that. The plot of the story is that two beautiful young people, the richest person in Singapore, Nick Young, and his girlfriend Rachel, are visiting Singapore, and they were madly in love. But Nick Young's family rejected her on the grounds that she didn't have blue blood. She was not coming from an affluent, rich family, and despite they being very much in love, she realized that it's not going to work, this relationship. And although Nick wanted to join her and leave everything behind, she realized that it's not going to work, and she decided to leave Singapore and obviously not cross his mum in particular. And on the way back to the airport, she stopped to see her friend with whom she studied at the university. And this is what her told her. Aquafina told her, "I respect you for your integrity." I really searched very hard to find a clip from the movie, trying a legal clip, but it was just not possible to find one because the film is still not released. But it was a very moving part of the whole picture, and she was respected because of her integrity, which she didn't want to compromise. So let's move on to governance now. Yes, we all talk about governance, but it's an extremely difficult concept to define and to explain. For the simple reason that it doesn't have an equivalent in many languages. I'm told by reliable source that Zhengqi, I'm not sure about my pronunciation, is the Chinese equivalent, but I can tell you that this word doesn't translate in many other languages, including Russian, my own Bulgarian, and you name it. So how do you explain a concept which doesn't have an equivalent in a range of different languages? But we can, at least we can try to do that, and here is my attempt. Essentially, the concept of governance as we know it today is rooted in what we refer to Western democracy. And we can define it as a Western construct. And we owe a great deal to the conceptualization of governance to the work of the influential German sociologist Max Weber, who essentially identified three key constructs that underpin the notion of governance. The first one is the presence of logical formality. In other words, he established the link between effectiveness, successful performance, growth, economic growth, and the rule of law. The second important pillar of Max Weber's understanding of governance was it was rooted in the Protestant religious ethics, which promotes certain economic behavior. And this in itself obviously is challenging, and we'll discuss this in a minute. And finally, the final premise of the concept of governance is that it is, because it's rooted in rationality, it aims to promote the bureaucracy in general, and in our case bureaucracy of sport, and to meet certain objectives in a manner that satisfy our understanding of that. And as you can see, because Western democracy tend to subscribe to this notion of the rule of law and common values, there is an aspiration, there is a drive for one-size-fits-all philosophy. So if obviously we agree that, that there is a causal relationship between good governance and effectiveness, then it makes sense for all of us to behave in a particular way. But of course, as you can see later on, this is hugely problematic. Interestingly enough, a major concern about governance started to appear in the early 1980s in the African context, where African scholars in particular were concerned about the relationship between state and society, and they really wanted to establish a good balance between state and society. So they started to raise this issue, and in particular the first codification of the notion of governance actually came in the form of the World Bank report back in 1989, when they established good governance as a model of behavior, if you like, and turn it into political conditionality. In order for the World Bank to offer financial assistance to the so-called developing countries, they had to meet certain expectations. And more recently, scholars and politicians started to distinguish between government and governance, whereby government is concerned with control and command, and governance a bit more horizontal, networking type of relationships. So we continue with the key question of what is governance. And I would like to emphasize the difference between the Protestant religious ethics and Confucianism, for example. As you can see, the Protestant ethics values and cherish very much hard work, investment, profits, and compare this to the Confucian ethics, which emphasize thrift and discipline, harmony, great emphasis on respect for authority, and of course high regards for education. Life is considered as an ongoing process of learning and education. And one doesn't need to look far away to realize this. A quick analysis of Sport Singapore on values clearly tells us that governance is a culturally laden concept. So if you look at the Sport Singapore statement and the core values to which they subscribe, as you can see them, their passion for sport, strength of teamwork, and care for people. And you only have to look at Confucianism and you immediately realize that the filial piety, the first core absolute value of Confucianism, which is respect, absolute respect to your ancestors, to elderly people, taking care of your parents, being obedient. It's at the heart of this belief. The second is humanness, which is care and respect for other people, absolute consideration for other people, central value. But humanness is based on the first one, on filial piety. And finally, of course, we have rituals, which in the Confucian terms implies that doing things properly, in the proper context, behaving properly. Rituals are absolutely essential for the sustaining of the practice of sport. Sport cannot be sustained, sport as such, as we know it, without institutions to support the practice of sport. And by the way, Max Weber was very aware of the value differences between the West and the East. He particularly cherished and appreciated the charismatic traditional leadership of China and India. So he was aware of those differences, but somehow we tend to forget it now. So, and this is what Confucius himself used to believe. He was a great believer in the importance of government, but he somehow thought that when virtuous men led by moral example, the rest will follow, which of course is true, but not necessarily more than complex organizations such as sport organizations. Things are a bit more complex. So let me give you a quick theoretical perspective on governance, both theoretical and practical. Scholars almost agree that there are three interrelated interpretations of governance. The first one is governance in terms of a political theory, which implies a relationship between state and society, and to what extent society can curb or control the hegemony of the state. To what extent we, as a civil society, allow the state to proceed and to tell us what to do. The second interpretation of governance is as an institution. In other words, how we steer the process of governance and to enhance the capacity of the government to achieve results which are beyond their own capacity. In other words, to engage with other actors, non-governmental actors. And the final interpretation of governance, is as an empirical phenomenon. I'll touch on each of them in more detail. So the first one, the first interpretation of governance is as an exchange between state and society. And the key, just to illustrate how this impacts sport, we take a quote from the UK, the current UK governance code, which is considered to be the most advanced in the world. Have a look for yourself. It clearly implies that organizations which are receiving public funding, they must meet certain standards. In other words, public funding has become a political conditionality. The state, the government tells sport organization how to behave if they were to receive some funding. So the key question here for us is the question of autonomy. To what extent we, sport organizations, will be prepared to negotiate, if you'd like, our autonomy and to allow the state to tell us what and how to do. And there is no need to remind you that political parties, and they change offices very often, and with them they change their understanding of sport and the role of sport in society. And by the way, this was an issue which was recognized by Pierre de Coubertin himself, even at the beginning of the 20th century. And this is what he had to say. He was very aware of what he called the ugly head of the state. When the state appears on the scene, all of a sudden the relationship between state and society becomes a bit problematic. The second interpretation of governance is in terms of an institution. And I've got an example of different governance systems here for you just to consider. The first one is from the International Olympic Committee. They've got their 8 principles of governance. Then we have Play the Game, an independent voluntary organization. And finally, the Council of Europe, a pan-governmental organization across all 47 European states. They all have their different interpretations of governance. The key concerns of all these interpretations is effectiveness. Why? Because they all believe that if we were to have a good governance system in place, this will inevitably enhance the capacity of sport organizations to tackle different issues. They will become more successful. They will be able to bring more medals, more success, more participants, and all the rest. Well, this, of course, is problematic, as we'll see in a minute. And the final interpretation of governance is as an instrument. In other words, as an empirical phenomena, the policy instruments we use in practice in order to change the behavior of sport organizations. And here I've got 3 examples of 3 current codes of governance. 2 from the UK, which are equally valid at the same time. The first one is Sport England current code of governance, sports governance, which is based on 5 principles. Then you have the Sport and Recreation Alliance Code of Governance. This is the umbrella organization of all non-governmental sport organizations in the UK, more than 300 of them. So this is the voluntary voice. Sport and Recreation Alliance is the voluntary, the voice of voluntary sport in the UK. And of course we have the Singapore, the current Singapore Code of Governance. The underlying belief of all this, again, is it's a normative concept because it tells you how to behave, what to do, how to behave personally as an organization. And if you look at the, again, across them, I mean, inevitably, you all, a lot of you are scientists and you understand measurement and relationship between different variables. So the obvious question you ask here is, but is it really possible for all these different systems, different instruments, to measure the same thing? They all claim to measure the same thing, good governance. So for example, right now in Brazil, they have 2 different codes of governance and operation. The one which is promoted by the Olympic Committee has 437 different items. Think about this, 437 different items. So the question is it really possible for all these indicators to measure the same thing? And if that's the case, they are obviously incapable of capturing important distinctions between forms of good and bad governance. So again, we need to be very careful here. So there are several problems with the whole idea of good governance on which I would like to turn your attention to. The starting point again is our belief that good governance is about controlling the behavior, designed to control the behavior of different organizations and individuals working in those organizations. The second core belief is that if we were to have good governance in place, this will inevitably enhance the effectiveness of our work. But, as I said, there are 3 problems, at least, with this. The first one is that sport organizations have multiple mandates. I will illustrate this in a minute. In other words, they don't pursue a single objective. They pursue a range of different objectives. And it becomes problematic. The second one is that sport organizations have different capacities. They have different histories, different commercial potential, different sizes, different budgets. So they have different capacities. And finally, even within a single sport organization, you can still have a range of different organizational cultures. So if you were to use Robert Quinn's well-established classification of types of organizational culture, he and colleagues distinguish between at least 4 different styles of organizational culture, such as autocracy, clan, market, and hierarchy. And the key point is that each of these different cultures, organizational culture, will have different interpretations of the meaning of effectiveness. They'll have different idea as to how to measure effectiveness and what effectiveness means for them. Unfortunately, we don't have time to elaborate in more details, but that's the message. That's problem, no problem. So just to illustrate the first point, the first problem with sport organization different mandates, have a look at these 2 examples. This is the current Sport England strategy for an active nation. And as you can see immediately, there are 5 main priorities. I hope you can see this. The first one is to enhance the personal well-being of people. The second is to enhance the mental well-being of people. And then 3 developmental missions, personal, social, and economic development. So think for a moment, sport has been charged to deliver all these different missions. It's not just to produce elite athletes and to turn a youngster into a elite performer, but to deliver on a range of other different activities. And same, by the way, same story with the Singapore Vision 2030 program, strategy. Pick up any of these points and you can see a range of very diverse objectives, from establishing successful sport clubs to leagues to economic development. Again, sport organizations are being charged with a range of different activities and mandates. They don't pursue a single objective. And this in itself presents a serious problem, serious challenge for understanding and measuring effectiveness. And this is why the link between governance and effectiveness is not that straightforward. In the corporate world, where the whole idea of governance comes from, things are fairly straightforward, but it looks like we tend to borrow uncritically the same ideas. And this is part of the introduction of the Singapore, this sentence here is part of the introduction of the Singapore Code for the Governance of Charities. Emphasis clearly on effectiveness, making charities more effective. Again, the belief is that by putting in place certain governance principles, we'll become more effective. Fine, but how do you measure, how do you understand this? In the corporate world, effectiveness typically equates with profit. The bottom line is profit. If you are a company and if you're profitable, everything's fine. You're an effective company. End of story. But the reality is a bit more messier. The average turnover of the marketing chief executive of the big companies is 18 months, which tells you a lot. Simply because if you don't deliver the results, the CEO gets fired. So effectiveness equals profit. You deliver the profits and you're a good organization. With sport, things are a bit more complex. How do you measure effectiveness? What is effectiveness? Do you measure effectiveness in terms of medals or number of participants or the opportunities we create for people to participate in sport, or to opportunities for people with disabilities, for example? How do we measure effectiveness? It's a complex, very, very complex phenomena. If you look at the IOC Agenda 2020 document, they identify at least 18 different stakeholders, and they all have different interests. I emphasize the word interest because, unfortunately, we cannot just assume that we can govern sport simply based on value, rational value behavior. Social action is determined by interests as well and other factors. So it is very difficult to actually accommodate all these different interests and really establish and measure effectiveness in any meaningful way which can deliver results and knowledge for participants. And finally, I would like to move to the notion of integrity, which was part of the title of my presentation, and which is absolutely inseparable for the idea of governance, because the whole idea of governance is based on dialogue and decision-making, dialogue and establishing needs and establishing visions, and then making decisions as to how to proceed. Integrity could be probably, the easiest ways to describe integrity is as the integration of a person inner values with their outward action. In other words, what we believe in, our values, and how we behave as a result of our values and beliefs. But integrity is a bit more complex concept, because we can distinguish at least between three different types of integrity. The first one is the personal integrity, which the sport person must represent in everything they do. So when they establish the identity of the sport practice in which they take part in, they need to have personal integrity. We also distinguish between organizational integrity. Organizations are collectives of people. They're a group of people. And normally we talk about organizational behavior. So organizations also need to behave with integrity. In other words, they have to deliver what they promise to say, and they have to do this in a very consistent way. And finally, of course, we have processual integrity. And I'm sure I can see the parallels with the Confucian core values when they talk about rituals. So processual integrity has to do with the actual process of how we get things done. Do we follow the right processes, and do we always act with integrity? Or whether we actually compromise what we do. And to illustrate this point, I would like to give an example with one of the probably biggest scandal of our current time, which is the doping allegations concerning the Sochi Winter Olympics of 2014. And I'm sure we were familiar with the background to the story, and I have to explain. But I would like to emphasize the actual process that was fault in this case. So the WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, appointed Professor Richard McLaren, a Canadian professor of law, to actually lead the investigation, which was triggered by two allegations made by two different people. One was the former head of the Sochi anti-doping lab, Dr. Grigory Chenkov, and a former Russian athlete, Yulia Stepanova, and her husband, who used to be a doping officer. Interestingly enough, for those who don't know the details, this Russian athlete and her husband have been writing to WADA for about 5 years, and they sent more than 200 letters alleging certain wrongdoings in doping, but WADA never took action. And then all of a sudden, just before the Rio Olympics, Richard McLaren was given 57 days, pay attention, 57 days to complete this investigation. So he undertook the investigation. I'm not sure we'll be able to read this, but just to sum up, the first column is the term of reference that he was given. And as you can see, his term of reference was to establish whether there was some manipulations of the doping samples during the Olympic Games and whether certain athletes benefited from that, which is fine. The second column is about the standard of evidence used to determine the guilt of the athletes and the officials involved. And as a professor of law, he's very well aware he used the highest admissible standard of evidence, which is beyond reasonable doubt. This is the highest admissible standard of evidence used in any court of law. In other words, you can have no doubts about the evidence presented in this report. So this is in which, as he stated, all stakeholders can have trust in. And finally, you have the key findings, the final column on the right-hand side. And as you can see, the key finding of the column was that there was a state-sponsored program of doping and cover-up put in place with the Sochi Games, with the state with capital letter, of course. Now, I'm sure as a scientist, people who understand causal relationship, we can immediately see some mismatch between the terms of reference, what actually he was supposed to do, and the main findings of the report. And if you look in between, by his own admission, he never actually sought to interview or to talk to any Russian officials or athlete or person involved in the whole story. And then immediately the question becomes, but if that's the case, how can you possibly establish the guilt of a state and implicate the whole state in a situation without proper evidence? So all these concerns were actually picked up by the IOC themselves, and they identify 57 points within the report which they found completely unsatisfactory. And when eventually Russian athletes challenged the findings of the report in court, in the Court of Arbitration in Lausanne, of sport in Lausanne, they all won. And all the key findings of the report were actually challenged, and athletes were exonerated. Out of 95 track and field athletes, all but one were exonerated. The same with cross-country skiing, bobsleigh, and most of the athletes. So the question then becomes, what was the value of this investigation, and was it really to uphold the integrity of sport, or maybe to further undermine the integrity of sport? The first key concerns that we need to raise is that this report undermined a historically established no political stance, no corrupt government statement on the part of the IOC and WADA. And that's very simple. Organizations such as the IRC don't have the mandate or the capacity to investigate states and governments. They simply don't have the right to do that. So it becomes very, very awkward for an organization such as WADA to an IRC to pass a verdict such as guilt government without really investigating this. The second concern is about with the methodology used in the process. To what extent the methodology that was used actually met all the standards it was supposed to meet and to deliver results and outcomes that will be accepted by all parties concerned. And finally, what followed from this report, as I'm sure you'll be aware, the database of WADA was hacked, and we now know that a number of top athletes actually were given permission to use drugs under the therapeutic exemption rule, and for some of them, you know, the dosages and the kind of drugs they were allowed to use really raised serious concerns. In many countries, those dosages and medicines are considered really, really for people who are seriously ill. And you have to raise questions about whether we should expect those athletes who are on such strong medications to actually compete in the Olympic Games. In other words, at least in our analysis, this report, instead of upholding the integrity of sport, actually, because it violated the procedural integrity of the process, seriously undermined the whole premise. So the conclusion, the moral of the story is that even if you think you're doing the right thing, you must do the right thing. You cannot do the right thing with the wrong process, because the right is enshrined in the process. The ends cannot justify the means. So integrity, again, is a complex idea. It has to do with our personal integrity, with the organizational integrity, and of course, with the processual integrity. I will leave you with this, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions later on. Thank you very much for your attention. Share.